Hi, I'm Crystal, and today we're going to talk about watercolor, the best kind of watercolor for crafters. I just love watercolor. All of these products bring so much color and life to any project you use them on. Now, I've colored this entire page of flowers using 15 different watercolor products, different ones on each flower, but as you look at the finished product, it's certainly hard to tell which flower was completed using which product, which ones were expensive and which ones were inexpensive. So my conclusion, and I'll lead with that, is use the watercolor you have. That is the best kind. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. No, seriously. I stamped out this flower a bunch of times on a piece of mixed media cardstock, and I'm going to color each flower using a different product and talk about the pros and cons of each one. So I'm starting out with Prismacolor watercolor pencils. These are very, very similar to Prismacolor colored pencils. The pencils are very hard, and you want to be careful not to leave harsh lines when you are using the watercolor pencils because they don't blend out as easily as some other watercolor products. Now, I love watercolor products for their blendability, for their ease of cleaning up, for their lack of staining, all those things. But the Prismacolor pencils are not as blendable as some others. We're moving on to the Distress watercolor pencils. These are kind of halfway between a pencil and a crayon. They're quite a bit softer. They come in the Tim Holtz color range, so if you love the Distress color range, you will certainly love these pencils. And once these are colored, we're going to blend them using the same approach, which is just a plain paintbrush dipped in clear water, brushed across the watercolor pencil to activate it. If you have a water brush, that would certainly work. That's the point of a water brush. But I just have a plain paintbrush. So if you decide that you need to adjust the color a little bit, you can either wait for the project to dry completely and then apply a little bit more color, but you can also take your damp brush and touch it to the watercolor pencil to pick up some more color and apply that while the project is wet. Sometimes that's desirable from a blending perspective or from a time perspective, and it works just fine. You do get a little bit stronger color that way than you do if you colored straight on the page. Now you can see I still have some visible marks in my Prismacolor flower, not so much in the Distress flower. Next, we're going to move on to using markers. The first markers are Tombow markers. This is from a pastel set that a friend gave me as a cast-off. I don't know if she accidentally bought two, but thank you, Patty, for this set of markers. And we're just going to lay down some color using the markers on this mixed media paper. And it looks kind of wild, but the markers blend out beautifully, so it won't look that way when we're finished. The next markers are Arteza Real Brush markers. They cost about a third as much as the Tombow markers, and they are in a more brilliant or bright color range than this pastel set from Tombow, but the Tombow markers are super nice. I am again using a brush dipped in some clear water to activate the markers and spread them across this mixed media paper. It's not going to work as well if you're using plain cardstock, so I do think you need the right kind of paper. If you want to add a little bit of color, you can scribble the marker on any non-porous surface and pick that up with your damp paintbrush to add a little bit of color. Now we're going to see a close-up of the Tombow marker flower and then the Arteza marker flower. Now, one of the fun things you can do with markers, on a solid stamp, you can use the markers to color the stamp and then spritz it with a little bit of plain water. I've got a spray bottle. And when you stamp it down, you get a faux watercolor effect. That's hard to do with any other watercolor product, but it works great with the markers. Next, we're going to move on to watercolor palettes. This is Prang watercolor, which is a semi-moist product. It is very, very similar to the 8-pan set that you find at Dollar Tree from Crafter Square. So much so that I would not be shocked if they were the same manufacturer. I don't know that. They just seem very similar. And I'm just using the paint straight out of the palette and applying it to the page on damp paper. The color blends beautifully, the paints are very easy to use, and that flower is done in a flash. Next, we're going to move on from Prang to Artist Loft. Now, Artist Loft is a dry watercolor. My palette's a mess, but I'm going to just dampen the watercolor colors that I want to use. I'm going to dip my brush straight into the palette, and I'm going to apply the paint to damp paper because it will spread much easier on damp paper than on dry paper. And the paint works very similarly to the semi-moist. There's also a Dollar Tree palette that is very similar to this. It's a 13 pan set, very similar to the Artist Loft, and again, I would not be shocked if it was the same manufacturer. After the Artist Loft, we're going to move on, and the next type of watercolor palette is a Kuretake Gansai Tambi. These are Japanese watercolors with a very high glycerin content, and the glycerin is sometimes animal sourced, so if you are concerned about that, this is not the brand for you. Now, this is highly pigmented, so I am going to take the color that I have selected off to this watercolor palette plastic dish so that I can water it down. Otherwise, the flower would be very brightly colored compared to everything else on the page. If you don't happen to have one of these inexpensive plastic palettes, a foam plate or a ceramic plate will work just as well, and I often use one of those instead of the plastic palette if it's not handy. So you can see that the Kuretake Gansai Tambi paint looks very similar to Prang and Artist Loft. They all turned out just fine. Next, we're going to move on to some watercolor paint that comes in tubes. I've got some Artist Loft. I have some Castle. These do have to be decanted into a palette and watered down a little bit. And then we are also going to use some Nouveau Shimmer Powder, which is a dry pigmented watercolor. A little hard to get that out and not get too much. And then some Daniel Smith paint. Now, Daniel Smith watercolor paint is a artist quality paint, but they do sell some samples that come in the form of these dots on a page. And the easiest way to use these is to simply cut out the dot and put the whole dot, paper and all, into your palette and moisten it with a little bit of water. Once I've got all of these moistened, I'm going to go ahead and get started painting, and I'm going to start with the Nouveau Shimmer Powder. So there are some special uses for this, and we'll get to that next. But here I've just reconstituted the shimmer powder with a little bit of water, and I'm using that like a paint. So this does give a lovely shimmery effect, a little bit hard to see in this photo, but it is just beautiful. Now here's the special use case for the Nouveau Shimmer Powder. If you sprinkle just a tiny bit of this on the page, and then spray it with water, it will activate the powder and just makes a lovely shimmery background. Now this is great if you're doing some kind of watercolor resist. Just gives a lovely effect. You do not need very much powder. You don't want to tap the jar. You can end up with a big mess if you get too much powder on your page. But if we spray it and let it do its thing for a little bit and dry, you just get a lovely background with that Nouveau Shimmer Powder. So that is the special use case. Now I'm going to go on to the tube paints. I have gotten these as cast-offs from my mother. She is mostly an acrylic painter, but periodically she'll decide to try watercolor, buy herself a set of tube paints because that's the format she's familiar with, decide she hates watercolor, and give me all of her tube paints. So I have more than one set of tube paints that I got in that fashion. I'm not sure why she has to keep learning that lesson, but I have certainly got a lifetime supply of these paints as a result. These work very similarly to a semi-moist paint, but you do have to water them down in a palette before you use them, otherwise they're just too strong. Now the Daniel Smith dots have reconstituted, and I'm going to go ahead and use them. The pink shade that I chose was not fabulous, but otherwise it's a very nice paint, but it's certainly beyond my skill level to use it effectively. And they are quite expensive. Next, we're going to move on to gel crayons. These work very similarly to the markers or to the watercolor pencils. You're going to apply them to a dry page and then use a little bit of clear water on the brush to moisten them. I do love a good gel crayon, and you can also manipulate these with your fingers, which is a lot of fun. Now we're getting close to the end, and I'm going to turn to ink pad smushing. So if you'd like to try some watercoloring and you don't have any type of watercolor paint, then if you've got ink pads, you can simply apply those to a non-porous surface like a plastic bag or a foam plate, or ceramic plate or whatever you've got, and pick up the ink with your damp paintbrush and paint with your stamp pad ink. Here I've got a little bit of Catherine Pooler ink and a little bit of Stampin' Up! Ink, and you can watercolor with that just as effectively as you can anything else. Now, ink pads do often have a little bit of a binder, so if the ink pad is not marketed as being water soluble, they have a little bit of a binder and they will not be completely water reactive. Distress ink pads are completely water reactive, but you'll see that painting with them you end up with quite the same effect as you do with the Catherine Pooler and Stampin' Up! Inks. These obviously come in Tim Holtz colors, so if you're a big Tim Holtz fan like I am, then you know that that's what you want. So the process is very simple and it's very similar no matter what type of ink pad you're using. But again, if you look at these flowers and you didn't know which product I had used on which flower, I don't know that it's easy to tell just from looking at it. And so my conclusion stands. Whatever type of watercolor medium you have, that is the best kind of watercolor for you as a crafter. But I hope that this tour of different types of watercolor mediums is helpful if you're trying to decide on a new product or if you're trying to talk yourself out of a new product. Either way, I certainly appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you have fun painting.